I never expected that moving to Maple Ridge Estates in suburban Columbus, Ohio would turn my life into a documentary about suburban warfare. But here I was, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning watching a police cruiser pull up to my house because someone had called the cops about dog poop frozen under 3 inches of February snow. My name is Yates Lawson, and I had been living in this supposedly peaceful neighborhood for exactly 8 months. I'm a software developer who works from home, which means I have the pleasure of witnessing every single ridiculous thing that happens on our street in real time. My wife Sarah was away on a business trip to Seattle, so I was handling our golden retriever Murphy alone for the week. Murphy is possibly the most well-behaved dog in Ohio, maybe the entire Midwest, and the idea that anyone would call the police about him was absurd. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He was maybe in his late 30s, with the tired expression of someone who had seen too many petty neighborhood disputes. His nameplate read Officer Mitchell, and he gave me an apologetic nod as he approached. "Morning, sir. I'm really sorry about this, but we received a complaint about dog waste on the properties in this neighborhood. The caller was pretty insistent we come out here." I rubbed my face, still holding my first coffee of the day. "Let me guess. Brenda Patterson from the HOA." Officer Mitchell's slight wince told me everything I needed to know. Brenda Patterson was the president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and she had made it her personal mission to make my life miserable since the day I moved in. She was 52 years old, drove a white Lexus SUV with a "Live, Laugh, Love" bumper sticker, and had the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," from 3 blocks away. Her husband Greg was a quiet insurance broker who always looked vaguely terrified, and I honestly felt bad for the guy. The issues started small. First, it was my mailbox being 2 inches lower than HOA specifications. Then, it was my lawn being half an inch too long during a week when I had the flu. After that, she complained that Murphy barked too much, which was hilarious because Murphy barely barked at all. He was honestly more likely to nap through a home invasion than actually alert anyone to danger. But Brenda had escalated things over the past month, ever since I had the audacity to paint my front door navy blue instead of the approved colonial gray. "Look, Officer Mitchell," I said, gesturing at my snow-covered yard. "We got 8 inches of snow 3 days ago. Everything is frozen solid. I pick up after Murphy every single time he goes out. I have a collection of poop bags in my trash can if you need evidence." Officer Mitchell held up his hand. "I believe you, Mr. Lawson, but the caller showed me photos of multiple yards with dog waste, and she claims it's all from your dog. She wants us to investigate." "Photos of what? You can't even see the grass right now." "That's what I said." Officer Mitchell pulled out his phone and showed me several pictures that Brenda had apparently sent to the police department. The photos showed various spots in the snow with dark patches that could have been anything from dirt to leaves to actual dog waste. She claims she found all of these around the neighborhood, and that your dog is the only one who could be responsible. I stared at the photos, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Officer, there are at least 15 dogs in this neighborhood. My next-door neighbor has 2 German Shepherds. The family across the street has a Husky. The couple 3 houses down have a Great Dane. How exactly does she know this is Murphy? She claims she has witnessed your dog doing it multiple times." "That's impossible. Murphy never leaves my yard without being on a leash with me right there, and I always pick up after him. Always. I'm borderline obsessive about it because I know Brenda is watching everything I do." Officer Mitchell sighed and put his phone away. "Look, between you and me, I think this is ridiculous, but Mrs. Patterson is demanding we do something about it. She's called the station 4 times this morning. Of course she has. She's actually suggesting we use DNA testing to prove which dog is responsible. I almost choked on my coffee. DNA testing for dog poop? Is she serious? Apparently, some HOAs are starting to require it. They collect DNA samples from all the dogs in the neighborhood and then test any waste they find to match it to the owner. This was insane. This was beyond insane. This was the kind of suburban dystopia that people made satirical TV shows about. But as I stood there in my driveway, watching Officer Mitchell's uncomfortable expression, I realized that Brenda had actually called the cops about frozen dog poop, and she wanted DNA evidence. You know what? I said, making a decision that I would later realize was either brilliant or incredibly stupid. Fine. Let's do it. Let's do the DNA testing. Murphy has nothing to hide, and I'm tired of being accused of things I'm not doing. Officer Mitchell looked surprised. You're agreeing to this? Absolutely. In fact, I'll pay for it myself if I have to, because once this proves that Murphy isn't responsible, maybe Brenda will finally leave me alone. Mr. Lawson, these tests can be expensive. I don't care. I want this resolved once and for all. Officer Mitchell studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. If you're willing to participate, I can reach out to a company that does this kind of testing, but we would need to test all the dogs in the neighborhood for it to be fair. Perfect. Let's make it an official HOA thing. If Brenda wants to play detective, let's do it properly. What I didn't know at that moment was that I had just started a chain of events that would expose the biggest hypocrite in Maple Ridge Estates and make our neighborhood the subject of a viral news story that would be shared across the entire country. Officer Mitchell left after taking my contact information and promising to follow up. I went back inside and called Sarah in Seattle to tell her what had happened. She laughed so hard I thought she might actually hurt herself. DNA testing for dog poop. Yates, only you would end up in a situation like this. I'm not the one who called the cops at 7 in the morning over frozen turds, Sarah. That's all Brenda. I know. But seriously, what if it actually is Murphy somehow? It's not. I'm with him every single time. Unless he has developed the ability to teleport and poop in multiple yards simultaneously, it's physically impossible. Okay. Well, this should be interesting. Keep me updated. After hanging up with Sarah, I took Murphy out for his morning walk. He trotted happily beside me, completely unaware that he was now the subject of a police investigation. We walked our usual route around the neighborhood, and I made a show of picking up after him with one of my bright blue poop bags, dropping it in the nearest trash can. I noticed Brenda's living room curtains twitch as we passed her house. She was watching, of course. She was always watching. The rest of the day was relatively uneventful. I worked on a project deadline, took Murphy out twice more, and tried not to think about the absurdity of my situation. But that evening, I received an email that made everything much more interesting. It was from Brenda, sent to every single resident of Maple Ridge Estates. The subject line read, "Mandatory HOA meeting regarding neighborhood cleanliness." The email was exactly what I expected. Brenda had written a long, rambling message about the importance of being responsible pet owners and how the neighborhood's property values were at risk due to unsanitary conditions. She claimed that there had been numerous complaints about dog waste throughout the winter, and that she had personally documented over 20 instances in the past month alone. She announced that the HOA would be implementing a mandatory dog DNA registry, funded by a special assessment of $50 per dog-owning household. Any dog waste found in common areas or on other people's properties would be tested, and owners would be fined $500 per incident, plus the cost of testing. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. I read the email 3 times, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. Brenda was really going through with this, which meant she was absolutely certain she was right, which meant she was going to be spectacularly wrong. Over the next few days, the neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Some people thought the DNA testing was a good idea. Others thought it was a massive overreach and a waste of money. A few people suggested that Brenda had lost her mind entirely. My next-door neighbor, Tom, sent me a private message asking if I was really okay with this. "I'm more than okay with it," I typed back. "I want the truth to come out. Dude, Brenda has been obsessed with your dog since you moved in. What if she planted evidence or something?" I hadn't considered that possibility, but I dismissed it. Even Brenda wouldn't stoop that low, would she? Tuesday evening arrived with temperatures barely above freezing. I bundled up and walked over to the clubhouse, which was already packed with neighbors by the time I got there. The room held about 40 people, which was probably 80% of the neighborhood's residents. Everyone was talking in small groups, and the energy was tense. Brenda stood at the front of the room next to a projector screen, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and holding a stack of papers. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she had the kind of self-satisfied expression that made me want to leave immediately. Next to her stood Greg, looking like he wanted to sink through the floor. "Thank you all for coming," Brenda announced, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I know this is an unusual situation, but I believe it's necessary for the well-being and cleanliness of our community." She clicked a button on her laptop, and the projector screen lit up with one of the photos she had shown Officer Mitchell. It was a close-up of a dark patch in the snow. "This is just one example of what I have been finding throughout our neighborhood over the past several weeks. Dog waste, left unattended, frozen under the snow. It's unsanitary, it's irresponsible, and it's unacceptable." She clicked through several more photos, each showing similar dark patches in various yards and common areas. Some of them were clearly dog waste. Others could have been anything. I have documented 23 separate instances of this problem. I have witnessed the responsible party on multiple occasions, and I have tried to address this through normal HOA channels. However, the situation has not improved, so we must take more serious action. A woman named Helen from 3 streets over raised her hand. "Brenda, why can't you just tell us who you think is responsible?" "Because I want this handled properly, with evidence, which is why I'm proposing we implement a dog DNA registry. Every dog owner will be required to submit a DNA sample from their pet. Any waste found will be tested against the database, and owners will be held accountable." A man named Derek, who owned the Great Dane, stood up. "This is ridiculous. You're talking about spending thousands of dollars to police dog poop." "I'm talking about maintaining the standards of our community," Brenda shot back. "Property values matter. Cleanliness matters. If you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't object to testing." "It's not about having something to hide," Derek argued. "It's about this being a massive waste of time and money for something that probably isn't even a real problem." "It is a real problem, and I have the evidence right here." I raised my hand. Brenda's eyes locked onto me immediately, and her expression turned even more smug. "Yes, Yates. I just want to say that I'm fully in support of this DNA registry," I said, standing up so everyone could hear me clearly. "I have been accused repeatedly of not picking up after Murphy, and I want the opportunity to prove once and for all that I'm a responsible owner. So I'll be the first one to submit a DNA sample." Brenda looked momentarily thrown off, but she recovered quickly. I'm glad to hear that, Yates. I hope the results will encourage you to be more diligent in the future. I'm already diligent. That's the point. The meeting continued for another hour, with various residents arguing back and forth about the policy. Eventually, a vote was held, and the DNA registry passed by a narrow margin. Brenda had secured enough proxy votes from absent homeowners to push it through. Each dog owner would have 1 week to submit a DNA sample using kits that Brenda had already ordered from a company called Pet Genetics. The special assessment would be added to our next HOA dues. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me to express their support. Tom clapped me on the shoulder and told me he thought Brenda had a personal vendetta. Helen said she admired me for standing up to her. Even Derek, despite his earlier objections, said he respected my willingness to participate. But as I walked home that night, I felt uneasy. Brenda was too confident. She genuinely believed she was going to prove I was the culprit, which meant either she was completely delusional or she knew something I didn't. The DNA kits arrived 3 days later. They came in small packages with instructions for collecting a cheek swab from each dog. I did Murphy's sample that same evening, carefully following the directions and sealing the swab in the provided container. I dropped it off at Brenda's house the next morning, making sure to document the time and date. Over the following week, the other dog owners submitted their samples. According to the neighborhood group chat, all 15 households with dogs had complied. Brenda sent the samples to Pet Genetics with overnight shipping, along with several samples of the waste she had collected and carefully stored. The testing was expensive, totaling over $3,000, but Brenda had convinced the HOA board to cover the cost as a community safety expense. Now came the waiting period. Pet Genetics estimated it would take 2 weeks to process everything and provide results. Those 2 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. The neighborhood was divided into camps. Some people thought I was guilty and appreciated Brenda's vigilance. Others thought Brenda was on a power trip and felt sorry for me. A few people just thought the whole situation was hilarious and couldn't wait to see what happened. I went about my normal routine, working from home and taking Murphy on his regular walks. Sarah came back from Seattle and found the whole thing even more absurd in person. She took to calling Brenda Detective Patterson and made jokes about canine CSI. "You know what the best part about this is?" Sarah said one evening as we watched TV with Murphy sprawled across the couch between us. "If it turns out Brenda is wrong, she's going to look absolutely ridiculous. The whole neighborhood will know she spent thousands of dollars to prove nothing." "That's what I'm counting on," I said. "Maybe then she'll finally back off. But I should have known better. People like Brenda never back off. They double down." The results came back on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a video conference call when my phone started buzzing with notifications. The neighborhood group chat was exploding with messages. I quickly excused myself from the call and checked my phone. Brenda had sent an email to everyone with the subject line, "DNA test results available." My hands were shaking slightly as I opened it. This was it. This was the moment where I would be vindicated, where all of Brenda's accusations would be proven false, where I could finally live in peace. The email read, "The results from Pet Genetics have been received. I will be hosting an emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7 p.m. at the clubhouse to discuss the findings. Attendance is mandatory for all dog owners. The police will also be present." Wait, the police? Why would the police need to be there? I called Sarah immediately. "Did you see the email?" "Yeah, I saw it. Why are the police coming?" "I have no idea. Maybe it's just Officer Mitchell following up." "Yates, this doesn't make sense." If the tests proved Murphy was innocent, Brenda would just quietly drop the whole thing. The fact that she's calling an emergency meeting with the police means something bigger is going on. Sarah was right. Something was definitely wrong. But what? The hours until 7 p.m. crawled by. I tried to work but couldn't focus. I took Murphy for a walk and found myself analyzing every step, every stop, every moment we had been outside over the past few months. I knew I had picked up after him every single time. I knew it. At 6:45, Sarah and I walked over to the clubhouse together. Murphy stayed home, probably for the best given the circumstances. The clubhouse was even more packed than the last meeting, with people standing along the walls because all the chairs were taken. Officer Mitchell was there, along with another officer I didn't recognize. They stood near the back of the room with serious expressions. Brenda was at the front again, but this time she wasn't wearing her usual smug expression. She looked angry. No, not just angry. She looked furious, and there was something else in her eyes. Fear, maybe. At exactly 7 p.m., Brenda called the meeting to order. Her voice was tight and controlled. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, we received the results from Pet Genetics regarding the dog waste found throughout our neighborhood. The results were very clear and very troubling." She pulled up a document on the projector screen. It was a lab report with a lot of technical terminology, but one section was highlighted in yellow. All 23 samples of dog waste that I collected were tested against the DNA profiles of all 15 dogs in Maple Ridge Estates. The results showed a match. A murmur went through the crowd. I felt Sarah grab my hand. "However," Brenda continued, her voice getting louder, "the match was not with the dog I expected." She clicked to the next slide, and there it was. The DNA match wasn't Murphy. It wasn't any of the other dogs I had suspected. Every single sample matched one dog, and that dog's name was Precious. Precious was Brenda's own dog. A small, fluffy white Pomeranian that she paraded around the neighborhood like it was royalty. Brenda was staring at the screen with her jaw clenched, and the room had gone completely silent. "I don't understand," someone finally said. "Are you saying your dog is responsible for all the waste, Brenda?" "There has clearly been a mistake with the testing," Brenda snapped. "I'm going to contact Pet Genetics and demand they redo everything. This is impossible." Officer Mitchell stepped forward. "Mrs. Patterson, we actually followed up with Pet Genetics this afternoon to verify the results. They ran the tests twice to be sure. There's no mistake. Every sample you collected came from your dog." The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some laughing, some angry, some just shocked. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Brenda had spent weeks accusing me and Murphy of being irresponsible. She had called the police. She had forced through an expensive DNA registry. And the entire time, it was her own dog causing the problem. "This is absurd," Brenda shouted over the noise. "Precious is always with me. She never goes anywhere alone. Someone must have been collecting her waste and spreading it around to frame me." "Mrs. Patterson," Officer Mitchell said calmly, "can I ask you a question? Do you let Precious out in your backyard alone?" "Of course I do. She has a doggy door." "And is your backyard fenced?" Brenda hesitated. "We have a partial fence, but Precious knows not to leave the yard." "Dogs don't always follow those rules, madam." "Is it possible that Precious has been leaving your yard and going to the bathroom elsewhere?" "Absolutely not. Precious is very well trained." Tom stood up from his seat. "Brenda, I've seen your dog in my yard multiple times. I always assumed she was with you or Greg, but now that I think about it, I usually saw her alone early in the morning." Helen nodded. "I've seen her too. She was in the common area by the mailboxes last week." Other people started chiming in with their own sightings of Precious wandering around the neighborhood. It became clear that Brenda's supposedly well-trained dog had been roaming freely throughout Maple Ridge Estates, doing her business wherever she pleased, while Brenda had been so focused on blaming me that she never noticed. Brenda's face had gone from red to pale. Greg, sitting in the front row, had his head in his hands. Furthermore, Officer Mitchell continued, pulling out a notepad. Making false police reports is a crime in Ohio, Mrs. Patterson. You called our department multiple times claiming you had witnessed Mr. Lawson's dog causing this problem. You showed us photos and insisted you had seen it happen. That was a lie. I thought I saw it, Brenda protested. I believed it was his dog, but you didn't actually witness it, did you? You assumed it was him and called us anyway. Brenda didn't answer. The second officer stepped forward. We're also concerned about the harassment Mr. Lawson has been experiencing. Filing false HOA complaints, making unfounded accusations, targeting a specific resident. That could constitute harassment under Ohio law. I hadn't expected this turn. I had wanted to be proven innocent, yes, but I hadn't anticipated Brenda facing actual legal consequences. Now wait a minute, I said, standing up. Everyone turned to look at me. Look, I wanted the truth to come out, and it did, but I'm not trying to get anyone arrested. Mr. Lawson, she wasted police resources with false reports, Officer Mitchell said. That's a matter for the department now, regardless of whether you press charges for harassment. I understand, but can we just take a step back here? Brenda, I'm not happy about any of this. You've made my life difficult for months, but I don't want to see you arrested. I just want to live in peace. Brenda was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shame, anger, disbelief. However, I continued, looking around at the other residents, I do think we need to discuss Brenda's position as HOA president, because this wasn't just about dog poop. This was about abuse of power. She used her position to target me specifically, to waste community money on a vendetta, and to force through policies based on false accusations. That's not leadership. There was a murmur of agreement from several people. Derek stood up. I move that we hold an emergency vote on Brenda's position as HOA president. I second that, Helen said immediately. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but Greg put a hand on her arm and whispered something to her. She sat down heavily in her chair. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. It was decided that there would be a formal vote the following week on whether Brenda should be removed as president. Officer Mitchell took Brenda aside to discuss the false police reports, though he ultimately decided to issue her a warning rather than pressing charges, especially given my statement that I didn't want to pursue harassment allegations. The HOA board also voted to refund my $50 DNA testing fee and to issue a formal apology. As people filed out of the clubhouse, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand or apologize for doubting me. Tom offered to buy me a beer. Helen gave me a hug and told me I had handled everything with remarkable grace. Sarah and I walked home in the cold night air, our breath making clouds in front of us. That was the most surreal thing I've ever witnessed, Sarah said. Did that really just happen? I think so. I'm still processing it. Brenda's dog. The entire time it was Brenda's dog. The irony is almost too perfect. When we got home, Murphy greeted us at the door with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging, completely oblivious to the drama he had been at the center of. I knelt down and scratched behind his ears. You're a good boy, Murphy. A very good boy who has been vindicated by science. The following week brought even more developments. A local news station somehow got wind of the story, and a reporter named Jessica Torres reached out to interview me. I initially declined, but after talking it over with Sarah, I decided that maybe getting the story out there would help prevent similar situations in other neighborhoods. The interview was conducted in my living room with Murphy photogenically sprawled on the couch beside me. I explained the whole saga, from Brenda's initial accusations to the DNA testing to the reveal at the meeting. Jessica was clearly delighted by the story, calling it the perfect example of HOA overreach and poetic justice. The segment aired 2 days later on the evening news. It was a 3-minute piece titled, "HOA President's Accusations Backfire After DNA Test Reveals Her Own Dog Was the Culprit." The story included interview clips with me, some footage of the neighborhood, and even a brief statement from Officer Mitchell confirming the basic facts. They blurred Brenda's face and used only her first name, but anyone in Maple Ridge Estates knew exactly who they were talking about. The story went viral almost immediately. It was picked up by national news websites, shared tens of thousands of times on social media, and even mentioned on a late-night talk show. People across the country were laughing at the absurdity of the situation and using it as an example of HOA horror stories. The phrase, "Brenda's dog," became a shorthand in online communities for situations where someone accusing others turns out to be guilty themselves. In Maple Ridge Estates, the fallout continued. The vote on Brenda's position as HOA president was held the following Tuesday. She lost by an overwhelming margin, with only 3 votes in her favor. A new president was elected, a retired teacher named Margaret Ellis, who promised a more reasonable and less authoritarian approach to neighborhood governance. One of her first acts was to dismantle the mandatory DNA registry, issuing refunds to everyone who had paid the assessment. Brenda and Greg stopped attending neighborhood events. Their house went up for sale 3 weeks later. I felt a complicated mix of emotions about that. On one hand, I was relieved I wouldn't have to deal with her anymore. On the other hand, I hadn't wanted to drive anyone out of their home, but Tom told me that Greg had confided in him that they had been planning to move anyway. Brenda was apparently humiliated by the whole situation and couldn't face the neighbors anymore. The house sold quickly, and a young couple with a newborn baby moved in. They didn't have a dog, which seemed fitting somehow. Life in Maple Ridge Estates slowly returned to normal, or what passed for normal in suburban Ohio. Spring arrived, the snow melted, and the yards turned green again. Murphy continued to be his easygoing self, now something of a celebrity in the neighborhood. Kids would ask to pet him when we went on walks, and people would joke about his exoneration by DNA. The whole experience taught me several things about human nature and suburban life. First, that people in positions of minor authority often abuse that power in ridiculous ways. Second, that being proven right sometimes matters less than how you handle the situation afterward. And third, that karma, when it does show up, sometimes has a wicked sense of humor. About 2 months after the DNA debacle, I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Officer Mitchell standing there, but he wasn't in uniform this time. He was in casual clothes and holding a leash attached to a young German shepherd. "Mr. Lawson, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. I wanted to stop by and apologize for how that whole situation went down. I should have recognized it as a personal vendetta from the start, instead of treating it like a legitimate complaint. "You were just doing your job," I said. "And honestly, if you hadn't taken it seriously, we might never have gotten to the truth." "Maybe. But still, I felt like I owed you an apology. Also, I wanted to introduce you to Zeus. I just adopted him last week and I'm moving into the neighborhood next month. The house 3 streets over." "You're moving to Maple Ridge Estates. After everything you witnessed," Officer Mitchell laughed. Well, despite the drama, it seems like a nice neighborhood. And now that the previous HOA president is gone, I figure it's probably a safer bet. Plus, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to help me train Zeus. You clearly know how to raise a well-behaved dog, and I'm new to this. I looked down at Zeus, who was sitting politely at Officer Mitchell's feet, and then back at Murphy, who had come to investigate the visitor. I'd be happy to help, and welcome to the neighborhood. I promise it's not usually this crazy. I certainly hope not. As spring turned into summer, Maple Ridge Estates settled into a peaceful routine. The new HOA president focused on actual community issues like organizing a neighborhood garage sale and arranging for the common areas to be landscaped. There were no more witch hunts over dog poop or demands for DNA testing. People went about their lives, mowed their lawns, and actually enjoyed living there. I helped Officer Mitchell, whose first name turned out to be James, train Zeus. The dog was smart and eager to learn, and James proved to be a dedicated owner. We became friends, bonding over our shared experience with the absurdity of suburban HOA politics. His presence in the neighborhood, even off-duty, seemed to keep things calmer. People were less likely to escalate petty disputes when they knew a police officer lived 2 streets over. Sarah and I settled into a comfortable rhythm as well. The stress of constantly being watched and criticized lifted, and I remembered why we had chosen to buy a house in this neighborhood in the first place. It was quiet, safe, and convenient to both our jobs. The neighbors, with a few exceptions, were friendly and reasonable people. One evening in late June, Tom organized a neighborhood barbecue in the common area. It was the first big community event since the DNA testing scandal, and there was some nervousness about how it would go. But it turned out to be exactly what Maple Ridge Estates needed. People brought food, kids ran around playing, and dogs, including Murphy and Zeus, played together on the grass. Margaret Ellis, the new HOA president, gave a brief speech thanking everyone for coming and emphasizing that the HOA should serve the residents, not the other way around. There was genuine applause. As the sun set and people started heading home, Tom pulled me aside. "You know, I've been thinking about that whole situation with Brenda," he said, "and I realized something. If you had reacted differently, if you had been vindictive or petty about it, the whole neighborhood would still be divided. But you handled it with class, and that made all the difference." "I just wanted the truth to come out," I said. "Everything else was just noise." "Well, it mattered. A lot of us learned something from watching how you dealt with it, so thanks for that." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and shook his hand. The story of Brenda and the DNA testing became part of Maple Ridge Estates lore. New residents would hear about it and laugh, asking if it really happened. People who lived through it would roll their eyes and confirm that yes, it absolutely did. It became a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of checking your own backyard before accusing your neighbors. I never heard from Brenda again after she moved. I occasionally wondered if she had learned anything from the experience, or if she was causing problems in whatever new neighborhood she had landed in. I hoped, for her sake and her neighbors' sake, that she had gained some self-awareness, but I wasn't optimistic. As for Precious, the little Pomeranian who had inadvertently caused so much chaos, I hope she was happy wherever she ended up. None of this had been her fault. She was just a dog who liked to explore and didn't understand property boundaries or HOA regulations. In a way, she had done me a favor by exposing Brenda's hypocrisy. The following autumn brought new challenges to the neighborhood, but they were the normal kind. Discussions about leaf removal schedules and holiday decoration guidelines. Someone wanted to organize a Halloween party for the kids. There was a brief debate about whether to resurface the basketball court in the common area. These were the kinds of issues that an HOA should be dealing with, not crusades against innocent residents based on unfounded accusations. I continued working from home, taking breaks to walk Murphy around the neighborhood. We established a routine where we would stop by James's house and walk Zeus as well, the three of us making a circuit through Maple Ridge Estates. Other dog owners would sometimes join us, and these walks became an informal social time for the pet owners in the community. One October afternoon, as we were walking past the house where Brenda used to live, the new owners were out in the yard playing with their baby. They waved at us, and we stopped to chat for a few minutes. They mentioned how much they loved the neighborhood and how friendly everyone had been. We actually heard a funny story about the previous owners, the husband said. Something about dog poop and DNA testing. James and I exchanged glances. It's a long story, I said, but it has a happy ending. As we walked away, James chuckled. Think they'll ever hear the full version, probably. Someone at the next HOA meeting will bring it up. It's too good a story not to tell, true. And it does have a certain poetry to it, the accuser becoming the accused. Evidence proving the opposite of what was expected, justice prevailing in the end. You sound like you're writing a police report. Force of habit. The years that followed brought normal suburban changes to Maple Ridge Estates. Some families moved away for job relocations or retirement. New families moved in with kids and pets. The neighborhood evolved but maintained its essential character as a quiet, friendly community. The DNA testing scandal faded into history, though it was never quite forgotten. Murphy got older and slower but remained healthy and happy. Sarah and I talked about getting a second dog someday. James and Zeus became fixtures of the neighborhood, with James eventually joining the HOA board to help keep things running smoothly. Tom started organizing regular neighborhood events, creating a stronger sense of community than had existed during Brenda's tenure as president. I never did repaint my front door back to colonial gray. It stayed navy blue, a small act of resistance that no longer mattered because the new HOA board had relaxed the color restrictions. Several other residents painted their doors in different colors as well, bringing more personality to the neighborhood. Looking back on that winter when Brenda called the cops about frozen dog poop, I recognized it as a turning point, not just for me personally, but for the entire community. It forced everyone to examine what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in, and what role the HOA should play in their lives. The answer, it turned out, was that people wanted reasonable rules enforced fairly, not authoritarian control based on personal vendettas. The media attention the story received also had a broader impact. Several HOA reform bills were introduced in the Ohio state legislature, aimed at preventing the kind of overreach that Brenda had attempted. While most didn't pass, they sparked conversations about the proper scope of HOA authority. Online communities dedicated to HOA horror stories adopted Brenda's dog as a rallying cry, a reminder to check your own compliance before attacking your neighbors. As for me, I learned to stand up for myself in situations where I knew I was right. I learned that sometimes the truth takes time to emerge, but that it's worth waiting for. And I learned that communities are shaped by how they respond to conflict, not by the absence of conflict itself. Murphy, for his part, learned nothing from the experience. He remained blissfully unaware that he had been at the center of a neighborhood scandal, or that DNA evidence had cleared his name. He was content to nap in sunny spots, go on walks, and occasionally steal food from the kitchen counter when he thought no one was looking. He was, in other words, the perfect dog. and I was grateful every day that Brenda's accusations had led to proof of that fact. The clubhouse where the dramatic DNA reveal had taken place remained a gathering spot for the community. Every time I walked past it, I thought about that Thursday evening when Brenda's world had collapsed in front of 40 witnesses. I didn't take pleasure in her humiliation, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that the truth had prevailed. Years later, when people asked me about the craziest thing that ever happened in my HOA, I would tell them about Brenda and the DNA testing. The story always got the same reaction: laughter, disbelief, and comments about how that could only happen in America. And they were right. There was something uniquely American about the combination of HOA overreach, suburban drama, and CSI-style forensics being applied to dog poop. But beneath the absurdity was a serious point. HOAs wield significant power over people's homes and lives. When that power is abused by individuals with personal agendas, it can make residents miserable. The only check on that power is community engagement and the willingness of residents to stand up against unreasonable demands. I was fortunate that I had the resources and stubbornness to challenge Brenda's accusations. Not everyone would have been willing or able to do the same. Some people would have just accepted the blame, paid the fines, and lived under a cloud of suspicion. The thought of that bothered me, which was why I made a point of attending HOA meetings even after the scandal had passed. I wanted to make sure that Maple Ridge Estates never again became the kind of place where one person's vendetta could destroy another person's peace of mind. The final chapter of the story, if there was one, came about 3 years after the initial incident. I received a letter in the mail from an address in Florida. It was from Greg, Brenda's ex-husband. Yes, ex-husband. Apparently, the stress of the scandal and the move had been the final straw in their already struggling marriage. Greg's letter was brief and somewhat apologetic. He explained that he had felt trapped during the whole situation, knowing that Brenda was wrong but unable to stop her. He said that the divorce had been difficult but ultimately necessary. He had moved to Tampa and was starting over. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Precious was living with him and was no longer allowed to roam freely. She now went outside only on a leash. I showed the letter to Sarah, and we sat together processing this final piece of the puzzle. "I feel bad for Greg," Sarah said. "He seemed like a nice guy who was just overwhelmed by Brenda's personality. Yeah, I hope he's happier now. Do you think Brenda learned anything from all this?" "I don't know. I hope so. But some people are constitutionally incapable of admitting they're wrong." I wrote back to Greg, a short note wishing him well and thanking him for the update. I didn't mention Brenda except to say I hoped they had both found peace. He never responded, and I didn't expect him to. The letter was probably his way of closing that chapter of his life. As I sealed the envelope with my reply, I realized that I had also closed my own chapter. The whole bizarre experience had shaped me in ways I was still discovering. I was more confident, more willing to stand up for myself, and more aware of how communities function and sometimes malfunction. I was also more patient with Murphy, who had been such a good sport through all of it. Life in Maple Ridge Estates continued its steady rhythm. Seasons changed, people came and went, and the neighborhood evolved. The basketball court got resurfaced. The holiday decoration guidelines were updated. A new playground was installed in the common area. These were the achievements of a functional HOA, the kind of positive changes that Brenda never managed during her tenure, because she was too busy pursuing phantom dog poop violations. On the 5-year anniversary of the DNA testing scandal, Tom organized a tongue-in-cheek dog poop scandal memorial barbecue. It was his sense of humor, and most of the neighborhood thought it was hilarious. We gathered in the common area, ate burgers and hot dogs, and told stories about that crazy winter. New residents who had heard rumors finally got the full account from those of us who had lived through it. James brought Zeus, who was now a fully trained and remarkably well-behaved German shepherd. I brought Murphy, who at 8 years old was starting to show his age but was still enthusiastic about any gathering that might involve dropped food. Other dog owners brought their pets, and the common area became a happy chaos of barking, playing animals and laughing humans. At one point, Margaret Ellis tapped a spoon against her glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say thank you to Yates," she announced, "because 5 years ago he showed this community what integrity looks like." He could have handled that situation in a lot of different ways, but he chose grace and truth. And because of that, Maple Ridge Estates became a better place to live. So here's to Yates, to Murphy, and to the importance of DNA evidence in settling neighborhood disputes. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses or beer bottles. I felt embarrassed but also grateful. These were my neighbors, my community, and despite everything that had happened, I was glad to be here. As the sun set and the barbecue wound down, I found myself standing alone for a moment, watching Murphy sniff around the grass with Zeus. They had become best friends over the years, these two dogs who had been at the center of such different stories. Murphy, the falsely accused. Zeus, the dog of the officer who helped reveal the truth. Sarah came up beside me and slipped her hand into mine. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just that life is strange." 5 years ago, I was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning being questioned by a cop about frozen dog poop. Today, that cop is one of my best friends, and the whole thing has become a funny story we tell at parties. Who could have predicted that? Not me. But I'm glad it worked out this way. Me too. We stood there watching the neighborhood we had come to love, flawed but genuine, shaped by its history but not defined by it. Maple Ridge Estates was home, and all the drama that came with it was just part of the story. As we walked back to our house that evening, Murphy trotting happily between us, I reflected on the strange journey that had started with Brenda's accusation and ended with vindication and community. The DNA test that was supposed to prove my guilt had instead exposed the truth in the most ironic way possible. Brenda, so certain of her righteousness, had been undone by evidence she herself demanded. There was a lesson there about hubris, about the dangers of absolute certainty, and about the importance of looking inward before casting blame outward. Whether Brenda ever learned that lesson, I would never know. But I hope that somewhere, in whatever neighborhood she now tormented or perhaps had learned to live peacefully in, she occasionally thought about that Thursday evening when the DNA results came back and her world turned upside down. As for me, I was content with the outcome. My reputation was restored, my dog was exonerated, and my neighborhood was thriving under better leadership. The whole ridiculous saga had become a source of amusement rather than stress, and that felt like the best possible ending. Murphy nudged my hand with his nose, reminding me it was time for his dinner. I scratched behind his ears, grateful once again for this good dog who had been at the center of such chaos through no fault of his own. He had handled the whole thing with more dignity than most of the humans involved, simply by being himself. That night, as I sat on my couch with Sarah watching a movie and Murphy snoring beside us, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The drama was over, the truth had prevailed, and life had returned to normal. Or rather, life had found a new normal, one built on the lessons learned from conflict and the strength of community bonds tested and proven. The story of Brenda, and the dog poop DNA scandal would be told for years to come in Maple Ridge Estates, passed down to new residents as both entertainment and warning. It would serve as a reminder of what happens when HOA power goes unchecked and when personal vendettas masquerade as community concern. It would also stand as proof that truth, when pursued honestly and without malice, has a way of emerging even from the most unlikely circumstances. And somewhere in Florida, I imagined Precious the Pomeranian was still taking walks, now safely on a leash, completely unaware that she had been the star of a drama that captivated an entire community and went viral across the nation. She was just a dog who liked to wander and explore, whose natural behavior had inadvertently exposed her owner's hypocrisy and freed an innocent neighbor from months of false accusations. In the end, that was the real story. Not about dog poop or DNA testing or even HOA politics, but about how truth emerges when we're brave enough to seek it, how communities heal when they choose grace over vindictiveness, and how sometimes the most unlikely events can bring about the most necessary changes. Maple Ridge Estates was better for having gone through the scandal. We were more aware, more engaged, and more committed to being good neighbors. The HOA functioned as it should, serving rather than ruling. And I could finally walk Murphy around the neighborhood without feeling watched and judged, knowing that scientific evidence had proven what I had known all along. Life in suburban Ohio continued, with all its quirks and complications. But now when I looked at my neighbors, I saw people who had stood by me when it mattered. I saw a community that had chosen truth over comfortable lies. And I saw hope that maybe, just maybe, HOAs didn't have to be the authoritarian nightmares that so many people feared. That hope was Brenda's unintended gift to Maple Ridge Estates. By being such a perfect example of what not to do, she had taught us all what kind of community we wanted to be. And for that, in some strange way, I was almost grateful. Almost. But mostly, I was just glad it was over and that Murphy and I could live in peace, our names cleared by the cold, impartial judgment of DNA evidence. Science, it turned out, was the perfect antidote to baseless accusations and neighborhood tyranny. And that was the story of how an HOA Karen called the cops about dog poop under snow, and an officer found that her dog's DNA matched every sample. It was absurd, ironic, and somehow perfectly American. It was also true, which made it all the more remarkable. Years from now, when I'm old and telling stories to grandchildren, this will be one of the tales I share. The time I was investigated for a crime I didn't commit, and the accuser turned out to be the guilty party all along. They might not believe me at first. It sounds too ridiculous to be true. But I'll have the newspaper articles, the viral social media posts, and dozens of witnesses to back me up. And maybe, if Murphy is still around or at least present in photographs, I'll point to him and say, "That dog right there was exonerated by DNA evidence. He's innocent and science proved it." And we'll all laugh, because what else can you do when faced with the beautiful absurdity of life in an American homeowners association? You laugh, you learn, and you move forward, hopefully a little wiser and a lot more careful about throwing accusations around. That's the lesson Brenda never learned, but that the rest of us took to heart. Check your own backyard before you start pointing fingers at your neighbors. Make sure your own dog isn't roaming free before you accuse someone else of being irresponsible. And most importantly, be very careful about demanding DNA evidence, because it might just prove you wrong in the most public and humiliating way possible. Maple Ridge Estates learned these lessons well, and we were better for it. And Murphy, bless his golden retriever heart, continued to be the goodest boy in Ohio, with scientific proof to back up that claim. What more could anyone ask for?